This is part 2 of 2 slidecasts that support Enhancing Intercultural Communicative Competence, a resource based on the Adult ESL Curriculum Framework. The objectives of this slidecast are to introduce you to the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, DMIS, discuss the importance of developing an ethno-relative mindset in ESL instructors and in learners, discuss the importance of teaching the topic of stereotypes. This is the outline of Part 2. In this section, we will look at TESOL's research findings derived from Phase 1 of this project and define stereotypes in relation to the stages in the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, or DMIS. We will also look at instructors' comments toward integrating ICC into ESL instruction and analyze the possible mindset. We will then look at how the DMIS stages are represented in learner behaviors and discuss strategies to work with them. We will conclude this section by introducing Chapter 2, which addresses cultural stereotypes. TESOL has learned that stereotypes is the least frequently addressed ICC topic in ESL classes. Many instructors are not comfortable with the topic, and one expressed, "Teaching these will obviously lead to racial or cultural stereotyping." But is this really the case? Where are these concerns coming from? Is there a way to build skills and confidence to address this in ESL classes? As you will see in Chapter 2 of the resource, a stereotype is a widely held but fixed and oversimplified image or idea of a particular type of person or thing. So, imagine your learner came up to you and said, "Are you Canadian? I know you love hockey." How would you feel? If you actually love hockey, you might initiate small talk. However, if you do not love hockey, you might not appreciate the assumption your learner made about you. Worse, your learner might not understand why you don't love hockey and negatively judge you for not being a real Canadian. Research shows some assumptions and stereotypes can lead to judgments, bias, or even discriminatory behavior. In the next few slides, we will look at how people experience and navigate cultural differences by using the DMIS. DMIS stands for Developmental Model of Intercultural Sensitivity, and there are 6 stages. Denial, defense, and minimization orientations are considered ethnocentric stages, and acceptance, adaptation, and integration orientations are considered ethno-relative stages. Stereotypes, which we discussed earlier, come from ethnocentric worldviews. In denial, cultural difference is not perceived at all, or perceived only in very broad categories such as foreigner or minority. The constructs available for perceiving one's own culture are far more complex than those available for other cultures. People in denial experience psychological and physical isolation from cultural difference. They are disinterested, hostile, and dismissive in intercultural communication. In defense, cultural difference is perceived in stereotyped and polarized ways. Cultures are organized into us and them, where typically the us is superior and the them is inferior. People in defense are threatened by cultural difference, so they tend to be highly critical of other cultures. In reversal, one's own culture is heavily criticized, while other cultures are perceived in relatively non-critical, romanticized ways. The intercultural worldview is still polarized, but the poles are reversed. In minimization, elements of one's own cultural worldview are perceived as universal. People in minimization assume that their own physical or psychological experiences are shared by people in all cultures, and that certain basic values and beliefs transcend cultural boundaries. The stressing of cross-cultural similarity reduces defense, so people in minimization are much more tolerant of superficial cultural diversity. However, minimization obscures deep cultural differences, including the masking of dominant cultural privilege by a false assumption of equal opportunity. In acceptance, one's own culture is experienced as just one of a number of equally complex worldviews. Acceptance does not mean agreement. Cultural difference may be judged negatively, but the judgment is not ethnocentric. People in acceptance are curious about and respectful toward cultural difference, but their knowledge of other cultures does not yet allow them to easily adapt their behavior to different cultural contexts. People in adaptation generate appropriate alternative behavior in a different cultural context. Adaptation involves intercultural empathy, experiencing the world to some extent as if one were participating in the different cultures. This imaginative participation generates feelings of appropriateness that guide the generation of authentic behavior in the alternative culture. People in adaptation can enact their intercultural sensitivity as intercultural communication competence. In integration, an experience of self is expanded to include the movement in and out of different cultural worldviews. People in integration often deal with issues related to their own cultural liminality, or in-betweenness. This liminality can be used to construct cultural bridges and to conduct sophisticated cross-cultural mediation. Now that we have gone over the DMIS stages, we will take a look at the following questions based on the pre-workshop reading assignments. Question number 1. What kind of challenges might ESL learners in defense denigration have while learning in Canada? ESL learners in defense denigration might not engage with instructors, classmates, or course materials in the way expected. For example, if they learned English with the instructor-centered grammar translation method in their home countries, they might view the student-centered task-based language learning in Canada as the wrong way to learn English. Question number 2. What strategies would you use to support them with the challenges described in 1? In order to reduce defense, it is important to focus on similarities. Using the example from question 1, if learners think the instructor-centered grammar translation method is the right way to learn, ask them why. Find out the goals and values behind their assumption. They might say the goal is to acquire a good grasp of language and to produce accurate language. Then you can explain that the goal of the task-based language method is very similar, to produce the most accurate language for the given context. Emphasize that you are working towards the same goal. The instructional approach may be different, but you are emphasizing that the goal is the same. Question 3. What kind of challenges might ESL learners in minimization universal values have while learning in Canada? Similarly, ESL learners in minimization might not engage with instructors, classmates, or course materials in the way instructors expect. This is because they assume similarities in behaviors and values in education. For example, some students might think being a good student means to listen to instructors quietly, taking notes, and memorize the correct answers and reproduce them in written exams. They might assume that this is the same here in Canada. They might not see the value in class discussions, group work, and discovery learning assignments, and as a result, not participate or struggle to complete these kinds of assignments. Question 4. What strategies would you use to support them with the challenges described in 3? Ask ESL learners why they do what they do and find out goals and values. In the case of question 3, learners in minimization might say listening to instructors and echoing instructors' opinions will make them good students. The instructor's role is to whip learners into shape by transmitting knowledge. Then you can explain that in the Canadian educational culture, there are different ways of being a good student. The instructor's role is to facilitate learning and provide guidance because learner autonomy is valued. Emphasize the goal is the same, but there's more than one way to reach the same goal. Instructors often have these kinds of conversations with learners when an intercultural misunderstanding happens, and they try to help learners notice the differences and similarities between the two cultures, to reflect, to try new things. But what we sometimes neglect to consider is the ICC of the instructor. We don't want to take it for granted that newcomers are automatically going to be in the ethnocentric stages, or that ESL instructors, by virtue of their contact with people from many cultures, have developed or reflected on their own ICC or attitudes towards ICC. What happens when an ESL instructor is in defense? How can this affect their abilities to help learners develop ICC? How might this affect their classroom practices? In this section, we will read 3 comments from Alberta ESL instructors who participated in the ATESL ICC research project in 2014. These comments represent their attitudes towards integrating ICC into their ESL instruction. After reading each comment, answer the following 2 questions. What DMIS stage might this ESL instructor be in? Why? What are the strengths, challenges of this stage? ESL Instructor 1 comments and DMIS. I question why culture is being brought to the forefront of ESL. Canada is a multicultural nation and is unique for this reason, outside of the government's continual urgent need to populate the nation for its economic benefits. Just let the students decide how much of their own culture to let go of after living here for a while. Who are better to engage and weight the differences between cultures? This Canadian test should help Canada decide if our multicultural experiment really works. What DMIS stage might this ESL instructor be in? Why? This instructor is likely in defense. The instructor talks about students letting go of their own cultures and calls it a Canadian test and a multicultural experiment. This implies assimilation is the right decision as opposed to adding elements of Canadian cultures to their own cultures, which is more of a cultural integration rather than melting pot scenario. What are the strengths, challenges of this stage? People in defense can tell you what is right and what is wrong. There are no ambiguous answers. However, people in defense expect newcomers to just figure things out on their own and just do the right things without appropriate supports. A common attitude of people in defense is, if they don't like it, they can go back to their own country. They tend to lack empathy for newcomers. ESL Instructor 2 comments and DMIS. I would like to know how students feel about being taught cultural information and intercultural communication. Do they find it effective, useful, and practicable? Or irrelevant to or intrusive in their lives, whether in or out of the class? How salient should ICC be relative to other curriculum? What DMIS stage might this ESL instructor be in? Why? This instructor is likely in minimization. The instructor is very open and curious about the idea of teaching cultural information and intercultural communication. However, probably lacks the necessary knowledge, experience, and confidence. The instructor does not want to offend learners. What are the strengths, challenges of this stage? Minimization focuses on similarities. Minimization is a very effective strategy to bring people together in a multicultural environment. People in minimization don't want to offend anyone by overt discussions of differences, and this avoidance can create a superficial harmony. The challenge is the lack of engagement with important differences, which can create issues and unintentionally exclude certain cultural group members. Avoiding discussions of difference can unintentionally ignore aspects of cultures that are valuable to the learner's identities, or deny the existence of important experiences that are informed by differences like systemic racism. ESL Instructor 3 comments and DMIS. Many students are anxious to learn about cultural information, but a significant minority are very comfortable in their little expat communities and have little or no interest in learning a foreign culture. How can information be presented in a way that these students do not take offense? What DMIS stage might this ESL instructor be in? Why? This instructor is likely in defense because of the polarized view represented in the language choices like their little expat communities and foreign culture, which suggests an us versus them way of thinking about cultures. What are the strengths, challenges of this stage? People in defense can tell you what is right and what is wrong. There are no ambiguous answers. However, people in defense expect newcomers to just figure things out on their own and just do the right things without appropriate supports. A common attitude of people in defense is, if they don't like it, they can go back to their own country. They tend to lack empathy for newcomers. By using the DMIS framework, we can look at the comments differently. We can understand how ESL instructors experience cultural differences and how they navigate through them. We have learned from the comments that working with diverse learners doesn't necessarily mean ESL instructors are interculturally competent. Rather, their views towards ICC affect their ESL instructional practices. Helping learners develop their ICC and ESL will provide learners with opportunities to understand themselves and their world more deeply as they transition personally, socially, economically, politically, and geographically to their new home, Canada. To review, the topic of stereotypes is the least frequently taught ICC topic in ESL in Alberta, which may come from the instructor's defense orientation. This raises an important question. How can we work with an ethnocentric orientation in an ESL classroom? It might be challenging for instructors with an ethnocentric orientation to help learners develop ICC. What we suggest is for these instructors to initially develop the language of the learners to align with what is socio-culturally appropriate in Canada, and eventually, learners may come to learn the intercultural aspects of their language choices. For example, "Are you Canadian? I know you love hockey," is an ethnocentric way of phrasing the idea. It shows that culture is perceived in a stereotyped and polarized way and is reflective of the defense orientation. So it is important for us as instructors to teach more ethno-relative language that shows the ability to check assumptions. This might sound like, "I hear many Canadians love hockey. What about you?" Doing this checks your perception and respects their individualism, which is a very important cultural value held by many Canadians. That being said, instructors who are of an ethnocentric mindset may not readily recognize language that is stereotyping and not inclusive. So they may not notice that "all Canadians love hockey" could be polarizing and may not think to teach different language choices. This is one of the reasons we developed lesson plans that can help ESL instructors do this. Because stereotypes was identified as the least frequently taught ICC topic, we have created 3 ESL lesson plans on this very topic. It's important to recognize that stereotypes show up in many different situations, such as in job interviews or performance evaluations. Research shows employers make assumptions about applicants based on their names, appearance, or accents. So it is important for learners to understand how people may be perceiving them and also to examine their own biases. This can lead to learning more inclusive behaviors and to more successful integration into Canadian society. Chapter 2 is designed to help your learners build language skills and intercultural communicative competence surrounding stereotypes. What the chapter aims to do is build the capacity of learners to be able to notice their own assumptions or the assumptions of others and make better informed decisions when communicating with others. The lesson plans come with instructor preparation resources and reflection questions. You will gain confidence as you teach these kinds of lessons more. This is the end of Part 2. In this part, we looked at the DMIS and unpacked a few instructor comments by using the DMIS. We also looked at the importance of teaching the topic of stereotypes and helping learners use language that is more representative of an ethno-relative mindset. We hope you will enjoy using the resource. Thank you.